After sailing all night, I woke up early, had breakfast, and went to the top deck to enjoy the nice scenery of this part of Egypt. I thought that this was a rather pretty part of Egypt. The city of Edfu has a population of almost 300,000 people, and their main industries are sugar refining and pottery making. As we continued up the Nile, a bridge loomed up ahead. I noticed that the crew had taken down the short mast on the front of the boat, and when I looked aft, the crew had lowered the sunscreens too. The clearance was about 8 feet from the bottom of the bridge to the top of our deck. I tried to jump up, but fat little old me couldn't quite touch the bridge. And here we have cleared the bridge, with the ubiquitous policeman looking down on us. Did I mention that Egypt is literally crawling with police? And here's the crew putting the sunshades back up again. I know this is silly, but I really wanted to help them do it. But I knew how inappropriate it would be to help them out, so I just took some pictures. Here's the bridge again, with a water tower of what I believed was a pottery factory in the background. And now we are approaching the pretty city of Edfu. We were supposed to spend part of the night tied up at Esna, but it was well that we got an early start by sailing directly into town. When we got down to the dock, and before even the gangplank was lowered, the funniest and one of the most memorable events of the trip occurred. A young fellow trotted up in his carriage, parked it right below our boat, and climbed out. He then shouted up, "Italianos, Italianos!" The people on the top of the deck with me didn't understand, and they kept asking, "What's he saying? What's he saying?" I said, "He's asking if we were Italians." So one of the passengers shouted down, "USA, USA." The guy put a puzzled look on and then shouted, "French, French?" Again, people asked each other what he was saying, and I told them he doesn't understand USA and he's asking if we are French. At that point, I leaned over the rail and shouted down, "Americanos, we're Americanos." And then the funniest thing happened. He got this big smile on his face, threw up both arms over his head, and shouted, "I love John Kerry!" I looked around, and at least half of the passengers had their mouths wide open with slack-jawed shock. I should explain that we had quite a few rather obnoxious and outspoken right-wingers on board. Well, I thought this was hugely funny, and I was so pleased. I shouted down to the guy that I'd ride his carriage if I had time. As it turned out, we didn't have time to ride any of the carriages. About a half an hour after arriving, we were met by a tour bus that took us to the Temple of Horus. This first picture is the remains of the vast, thick Nile flood sediments that covered and protected this temple for over 1,000 years. Can you imagine the hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of sediments that had to be removed? We approached the temple complex from the rear. It was impressive to see how perfectly preserved this structure was. Before going on, I'd like to mention that the ancient Egyptian believed that this was where the god Horus had his epic battle with his evil uncle Seth. Seth had earlier murdered Horus's father, Osiris, and had stolen the kingship of Egypt. When Horus was old enough, he battled his evil uncle right here and won, becoming the ruler of earthly Egypt, and thereby making all living pharaohs a living manifestation of himself, or something like that. Egyptian religion is so confusing. The temple may be built on ground that has been considered holy for many thousands of years, but the temple itself was started about 2,350 years ago by the Greek-Egyptian pharaoh Ptolemy III. The main part took 25 years to build, and the entire temple we see today was finished by Cleopatra's dad, Ptolemy XII, some 180 years later. The next three pictures show the right first pylon, the entrance, and the left pylon. Here's a close-up of the right pylon and its reliefs. Notice the pharaoh is wearing a different crown as he stands before the gods in each relief. If you look closely, you will see Horus, his wife Hathor, his mom Isis, his dad Osiris, and some other gods too. I guess the pharaoh was expected to do a lot of different things, so you might say he wore a lot of hats. The temple opens up into a beautiful court facing a hypostyle hall with columns that blend the simple ancient Egyptian lotus with a sort of Corinthian-style capital. Well, in my opinion, anyway. Note the exquisitely carved granite statue of Horus the hawk wearing a crown. Wearing that crown must have made flying rather awkward. I forgot to note, too, that in the entrance there was two other statues of Horus. See how fancy this was, and the colors are still present. How beautiful it must have looked in its day. And here's a view inside the hypostyle hall. Here's a scene from inside the second hypostyle hall. Here's the roof of the hypostyle hall showing openings for light. I didn't go up, but like the other temples, there was provisions for the god statue to be taken up to the roof once a year to recharge its solar cells. Deep inside the holiest part of the temple was a small carved stone shrine. I have no idea what it was used for, but it was beautifully made and sitting right inside the main shrine room. Once outside again, we could see the area the ordinary worshippers were allowed in, along with a stairway that led down to a sacred well, typical of other temples. Here's a passage between the outer wall, where the common people were allowed, and the inner temple, where the common people were forbidden to enter. This and the following are scenes looking down the passageways from different parts of the complex.
مع القوات السمائية ولنقل نحن أيضا مع أولئك.
Back inside again, we retreated to explanations of what the relief stood for. I'm sorry I wasn't able to take notes, and I'm sorry I didn't have the opportunity to study beforehand the details of this temple. This scene shows Horus on the right with his wife Hathor holding hands with the Pharaoh. I don't know, but if I was Horus, I think I would have pecked the guy's eyes out if I would have caught some pharaoh holding hands with my wife. The next scene shows what I believe is the pharaoh and the lady Isis holding sticks with Horus on the right. Notice the pharaoh is wearing an unusual crown. I asked the guide about this crown, and he said it was worn during festive occasions. So I said, "Oh, then it's some kind of a party hat then." He looked at me like he was going to say, "You smart ass," but then said, "Yes, something like that." You might notice that there are some heavy chisel marks defacing the pharaoh's image. We were to see a lot of this later on. It seems that the Greek and especially the Roman rulers were rather hated, and their images were defaced by early Christian times. Well, by 2:30 in the afternoon, we were back on board and heading south up the Nile to Kom Ombo. It was a bit warm, but there was a beautiful breeze up on the top deck, and the scenery was well worth seeing. This region is mostly a sugarcane and corn growing area. Some of the people seem to be farming and living in mud huts on long, low islands, and of course in swamplands. I have no idea how these water buffalo got on this island, except they were perhaps made to swim over there. Here we are approaching the temple where all the tour boats are docked. Actually, the view of the temple from out on the Nile was rather beautiful. And because it was approaching sundown, the temple was starting to take on a beautiful glow. It was after 5 p.m. when we finally landed and started touring the temple. Here's the guide showing us how the temple stones were held together with wooden wedges fitting into keyways cut into the rocks. Emer, my group's guide, is here giving a talk on the temple. Sorry, but again, I didn't take notes. I do know this about the temple. It was actually dedicated to two gods. One side was for the elder Horus, patron of kings, and the other was dedicated to the crocodile god Sobek, who was the representative of the power of kings. The usual main pylon entrance was destroyed centuries ago, so the entrance to the temple now is through a portal leading to a courtyard. That stone to the right of the fellow wearing the shorts is believed to be parts of the original altar. And here's a scene looking through to the remains of the hypostyle hall. Many of the structures in this temple date from Roman times and have images of Claudius and Nero accepting authority from the gods. By this time, the Romans were pretty much hated by the general population, and all this propaganda was not believed anymore. In fact, the loss of faith in the ancient gods, because they were now associated with the hated Romans, probably led to their early downfall and the acceptance of Christianity. Egypt during the Roman period was in a sorry state indeed. The whole country was considered to be the private ranch of the emperor, and he could do anything with it and its people he wanted to without having to answer to the Senate. Here's a column showing the elder Horus. Horus was worshipped in three aspects: Horus the child and comforter of his mother Isis, Horus the avenger of his father Osiris, and Horus the elder, patron of pharaohs. And here's Sobek, who is sometimes identified with Amun, the creator god. As a matter of fact, at one time, Amun was so powerful and mysterious that all the other gods were almost considered as a simple manifestation of each of his natures, and in a sense, the Egyptians approached a form of monotheism this way. If you will observe, even the crown is very similar to Amun's crown. As I said, Egyptian religion was very complex and confusing. Back outside again, this is the remains of a Roman portico off the main courtyard. Here is a little chapel dedicated to Horus's wife Hathor, and it contained a mummified crocodile. Nearby, there is a wall showing medical instruments. Ancient Egypt had a well-deserved reputation for having the best trained and skillful surgeons in the ancient world. Egyptian surgeons could perform delicate, life-saving skull operations called trepanning to relieve deadly brain inflammation caused by such injuries as fractures and subdural hematomas. There is some speculation that this temple also functioned as a medical school. I think my dad would have gotten a kick out of seeing all this. And here's one of those crocodile mummies found buried nearby that in ancient times were revered as representing the god Sobek. It was getting rather late, but from the temple we headed to a typical Upper Nile village. And I say that with some amusement because it was a little nicer than what you would normally consider a typical village. Anyway, this village was set up for the entertainment and education of the tourists. Here we have a guy using the oldest wheel in human history, the potter's wheel. And we saw the water pumping technology that was in use for the last 10,000 years or so, until rather recently when all the pumps were replaced with one-cylinder gas engines. And here's one powered by a couple of donkeys. And the good old counterweighted bucket model. They had an Archimedes screw set up, but they couldn't get it working. There probably wasn't enough water in the well to get it going. Since I didn't get a picture of the Archimedes screw, you will have to look up what an Archimedes screw is for yourself. We then went into a typical mud hut dwelling. It was so nice and homey in there, but it sure didn't look like the adobe huts we saw along the Nile. Those two vessels from the previous picture held different kinds of grain, and here's where the grain was ground by hand. And what typical adobe dwelling didn't have its own small bread oven? Here's a native style dining hall. And another native style party room. And this is your typical adobe hut bedroom. We then went into a party tent set up in the native style. The party tent included the fancy water pipes that are so popular with both sexes there in Egypt. Well, it was now getting late in the evening, and we needed to get back to the boat. That evening, we were to have that Galabea party, but I wasn't over the effects of the salmonella poisoning, and besides, I was not in the mood for partying with people I didn't know. I did want to go to the party for a few minutes to watch one of our tourists, who is also a professional magician. But I fell asleep in my room and missed the whole show,